fancy meeting you, let alone in my own closet. But while you're here, how about we do weekly roundup? But what is weekly roundup? Well, weekly roundup is where I realize that even if you want to watch the stream, you're not going to be watching every moment of it. So I take notes on things I say, things I think, while I'm analyzing someone else's writing or my own writing. I try to condense them into a little video like this. This week we were looking mainly at Cannery, John Steinbeck's novella. A lot of the book and the things I was thinking about the book revolved around image. In other words, we might have heard as show, don't tell. Making a reader understand your characters and your world without you explaining them. But why bother? Why bother with showing and not telling? I think there's several reasons, but I'll give you the two that I think are most pertinent. First is that it's more realistic. It's hard for a reader to take a book seriously and relate to it that deeply when it's so unrealistic to have this narrator, unlike in real life, who's just explaining why people are doing things and why things are happening and how the world works. It's uncanny, really. The second reason is that it is a more enjoyable experience for the reader when they can interact and make their own conclusions. By paying more attention, they gain more from the book. If you just have an explicative narrator, you don't get that. You can't interact with the book and get more out of it. It's kind of the art of corralling the imagination. Leading it in a direction, but giving it some freedom so that two readers can put their own spin on an image, but still not end up with totally different images. However, I will concede that there is possibly a point at which you should tell, because to simply show every single thing in the world, every single character, can be tedious. And at some point, maybe a character is not important enough for you to very precisely display them, and instead quickly sum them up, because they will be in the story very briefly. But anyway, for those times, which I think are the majority of times for when you will be showing and not telling, there are some good ways that Steinbeck shows us how to do this. He's describing a little rundown town in this book, and he does some techniques to really get this town kind of inside of you. The first one I noticed was how he uses different dimensions of description. He describes the town through place, really just as in what it looks like, but also through time, how it develops and decays through the day, and also through its people. He portrays its culture without ever saying it. For instance, he says how at a certain grocery store you can buy a silk kimono, slippers, and a cigar all at once, implying that people in this town do make purchases like that. So I'm not ever saying what people in the town are like, but kind of saying there are people in the town who act like this, thus giving you that image. There's other ways he does this, such as making images tangible. For instance, there is a part in which he's trying to show how there is a child who struggles with spatial relations, and a doctor says, he's like, sort these fish by seeing whether they're longer than your finger or not, and the child, for some reason that confuses him. Tangible image of a character. You can really feel that. You do that. You're like, I know if something's longer than my finger. And then when you see that the child can't do it, it's like that sticks with you. You actually feel that almost. That description of the character. Now, describing is hard. Images are harder to read and to understand. They're harder to make. They're kind of a drag. I just want to understand what's going on in the book. However, I would push back on that because I don't think it's necessary to always know what is going on in the book. Maybe it's good that you have to dwell in a bit of confusion and occasionally get an answer after you want it and have to look back and not have the author tell you right away the answer to every question posed. But still, I think there are danger to images. Among them is being too vague, perhaps. But another is some pitfalls you can fall into, such as, instead of creating an image, creating a list. Just a list of items that make up a thing, instead of describing a place or a person on multiple axes, like how Steinbeck describes a town not through just how it looks, but how it progresses through the day and how its people look, how its people act, and what its people are doing. Another danger is drawing out the image too much. And a good test to know whether your image is too long or not is by the time you're to the end of the description of your image, can you remember how the image began? If you can't remember how the image began, your description is probably too long. Furthering this idea of the fact that image is not the exclusive technique, there are some benefits to a more explicit analytical writing. The benefit with being explicit about psychology is that of a character is that you can go deeper into their motivations and really find very nuanced things about that character. So, if you're going to do that, then sure, explain this person's motivation. Give a peek into their childhood or whatever. But if you're not doing that, all you're doing is losing opportunity to display your character by just telling exactly what he's like, what he's thinking, but then not using that basis of what he's thinking and to go deeper into his psyche. And going deeper into the psyche, you can make readers more deeply and genuinely empathize with the person. So I do think it is quite legitimate to explicate psychology so long as it is very purposeful and accomplishes something that showing can't do. Another thing to note that I noted this week was that you should also think about the tone of the narrator. For instance, in Cannery, the narrator would make comments about how someone acted that in many contexts could just be considered being too blatant or on the nose. But because of the tone of the book, the tone feels like you're at a bar with some old dude just kind of telling you about his town, the things he's seen. It kind of makes sense that this narrator is putting his own twist, his own guesses on why people do these things. Things to keep in mind. Lastly, there's just a few ideas I picked up when I was looking at my own writing that I thought might be good to mention. First, probably the biggest, is that it's good to remember that language is full of implication. That a conversation, when you're writing conversation, it's not just the words. Everything you say has so many implications with it. And when you speak, you have your characters speak as if someone outside of the world needs to understand them, it will sound really clunky. For instance, if someone walks into a street and you see a car coming, you don't say, "Watch out, or you'll get hit by a car," because it's already implied that cars drive on streets. But a crappy YA author, if they themselves were in a world where cars weren't on streets and were writing a story of a place where cars were on streets, would do something like that. where they forget or don't realize at all how much of language and communication is just implied and connotated. And they would have their characters say something ridiculous like, "Watch out, because there are cars going fast on the street." So, in other words, think about when you are writing your character's dialogue, or even what your narrator says, think about the context of that world and what's implied already in the language. And then you can really cut down on the crap, really, and make the dialogue more believable. Even if it's less followable, more believable. I guess 2 more things then are left. Should be quick. 1, if you ever read something, and this might just be me, and you think, wow, I can't believe I wrote that. That was kind of poetic. Maybe consider that by poetic you mean you were taking too many words to do it, or you were using weird archaic words or word inversion in order to say something that you could have said with just normal words in a normal order. Just something to keep in mind. And lastly, I'd like to say, in this context of talking about showing versus telling, I think it may be helpful to think of something like telling not as necessarily as bad, but rather as a missed opportunity. Is it bad storytelling? That may be a bit harsh to say, but what you are doing is you are missing an opportunity to deepen your world and your characters. This reminds me of something that Steinbeck did, that he didn't have to, but it's subtle, and it really helps fill in the cracks of the world. In Cannery Row, there's a lot of reference to the ocean and ocean life. And while one of the characters, Doc, is going down to the ocean and collecting samples for his lab, Steinbeck uses metaphors that use the image of things in the ocean to describe what he's doing. What does this do? It's not necessary, but what it does is it takes a little opportunity. It wouldn't be bad necessarily or alienating if you used a metaphor that was not a non-sea life related metaphor to describe what was going on. But he is forcing you a little farther into the world, into the atmosphere, into the feeling and the color and the image of that world by doing that. Now, if anything I have said so far maybe doesn't make a lot of sense, it may be my fault. You may say, how am I supposed to understand without context? Sure, maybe my fault, but what you could do is you could watch the stream and then get context, or better yet, you could just go and read Cannery Row and be on a lookout for these things I've mentioned and see exactly how Steinbeck does do it. But for now, that's all I have to say about Cannery Row and about Steinbeck for the time being. I'll be streaming on Tuesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Sundays from 5 to 6 until further notice. And I'll be posting one of these every week on Sunday. So I hope to see you around.